May 15, 1991, Ramstein Air Base, West Germany. Sergeant Jan Kowalski, 32 years old, 10 years of service in the Polish Army, walked across the parking lot toward the base post exchange with his American escort officer, Captain David Chen. The exchange program that brought Jan to Germany represented part of the broader military-to-military contacts that accelerated after the Cold War's end. The Berlin Wall had fallen in November 1989. The Warsaw Pact was dissolving. The Soviet Union itself would cease to exist within months. But the ideological frameworks that had structured Jan's entire adult life remained largely intact in his thinking, even as the political structures that promoted those frameworks crumbled. Jan had been taught throughout his military career that capitalism exploited workers, providing only bare necessities while reserving luxury goods for the wealthy elite. American soldiers, the propaganda insisted, were pawns of the military-industrial complex, poorly paid, forced to purchase overpriced goods from stores that existed to extract maximum profit from working people. The abundance Americans claimed to enjoy was propaganda, theatrical displays created to deceive observers while hiding the poverty that capitalism inevitably produced. As Jan approached the PX building, he expected to see exactly that, a Potemkin store, carefully stocked with the best items available to create an impression of prosperity, while the real stores American soldiers used remained hidden. The Soviet Union had perfected such displays for decades, showing foreign visitors model factories, showcase farms, and specially stocked stores that bore no resemblance to what ordinary Soviet citizens experienced. Jan assumed Americans employed the same deception. The building was larger than Jan expected for a store. The parking lot was full of cars, suggesting substantial customer traffic. As they entered through the automatic doors, a technology uncommon in Poland in 1991, Jan braced himself to maintain appropriate skepticism about whatever propaganda display he was about to observe. The first aisle contained electronics. Jan stopped, momentarily confused by what he was seeing. 20 different Sony models lined the shelves. Walkmans, portable CD players, stereos, boom boxes, each with a price tag. $40 for a basic Walkman, $80 for a CD player, $120 for a shelf stereo system. The brands were legitimate: Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba. These weren't mock-ups or display models. These were actual consumer electronics available for purchase. Jan walked further into the store, Captain Chen following silently, recognizing the expression on the Polish sergeant's face and understanding what was happening. The clothing section stretched across an entire wall. Levi's jeans, the iconic American brand that sold on the black market in Warsaw for $200 per pair when you could find them, stacked in multiple sizes and styles, priced at $29.95. Nike shoes, another status symbol in Eastern Europe, displayed in rows, priced between $60 and $100. The household goods section offered small appliances, tools, kitchen supplies, items that Polish stores either didn't stock or required months of waiting and substantial connections to obtain. Coffee makers, toasters, electric drills, calculators, all priced, all apparently available for immediate purchase, all bearing brand names Jan recognized from Western products that occasionally appeared on Eastern European black markets at prices ordinary workers could never afford. The food section, smaller than the other departments but still substantial, offered snacks, drinks, candy, packaged foods. Variety that Polish grocery stores, even in major cities, couldn't approach. American soldiers could apparently walk into this store and purchase Coca-Cola, potato chips, chocolate bars, convenience foods that represented minor luxuries in Poland when available at all. Jan stopped walking and began calculating. His monthly pay as a sergeant with 10 years of service, converted at realistic exchange rates rather than the official rates that bore no relation to purchasing power, amounted to approximately $30 American. The Sony Walkman he was looking at cost $40. A single consumer electronics item that American privates apparently purchased casually cost more than his entire monthly salary. He turned to Captain Chen, who had been watching Jan's reaction with a mixture of sympathy and inevitability. Jan asked the question in careful English, wanting to ensure he was understood. This is fake store for visitors, yes? Show nice things for guests? Real American soldiers don't shop here. There is different store for actual shopping. Captain Chen shook his head slowly. This is a normal PX. Every American military base has one. Some are larger, some smaller, but they all stock similar goods. American soldiers shop here regularly. A private with basic pay can afford most items in this store. The prices are lower than civilian stores because there's no sales tax on base. Jan stood silently, processing this information. The implications were staggering. Everything he had been taught about capitalist exploitation, about workers struggling under oppressive economic systems, about the superiority of socialist organization that ensured basic needs were met even if luxury goods were scarce, all of it was contradicted by what he was observing. American privates, the lowest-ranking enlisted personnel, had purchasing power that exceeded Polish sergeants with a decade of service. And based on what he was seeing, they had access to consumer goods that simply didn't exist in Poland at any price. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Jan had served his country faithfully for 10 years. He considered himself fortunate compared to Polish civilians. Military service provided stability, regular pay, privileges that civilians couldn't access. Yet a 19-year-old American private apparently enjoyed a standard of living Jan couldn't approach, despite his rank, experience, and service. Jan spent 2 hours in the PX that afternoon, walking the aisles, examining products, calculating prices against his own purchasing power, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had believed about economic systems. When he finally left, he carried a single cassette tape, a small purchase that represented a significant portion of his exchange program allowance, but something tangible from an American store that he wanted to own and bring home. That evening, writing in his journal, Jan concluded with a sentence that captured his transformation. Everything they told us about capitalism was backwards. The exploitation isn't in America. The exploitation was us believing communist propaganda for 40 years. To understand the shock Jan and thousands of other Warsaw Pact soldiers experienced when visiting American PX stores, you need to understand what they expected based on decades of communist indoctrination and what their own military lives had been like. Communist ideology taught that capitalism exploited workers by extracting maximum labor value while providing minimal compensation. Under this framework, capitalist societies produced abundant goods, but distributed them unequally, with workers receiving bare necessities while capitalists accumulated wealth through exploitation. The inevitable result, Marxist theory predicted, was growing worker immiseration as capitalists competed to reduce wages and increase profits. Warsaw Pact military stores reflected the reality of centrally planned economies, where consumer goods were low priority. The typical military store in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, or other Warsaw Pact nations offered limited selection: soap, basic toiletries, uniform items, simple supplies. The shelves were often partially empty. Items that were supposed to be in stock weren't available. Quality was generally poor. The shopping experience was utilitarian at best. Obtain what was available when it was available. Don't expect choice or quality. Consumer goods that Warsaw Pact soldiers wanted required connections, bribes, or black market access. Western jeans, electronics, even quality domestic products were distributed through informal networks rather than normal retail. A soldier who wanted a decent stereo might need to know someone who could obtain one, and the price would be multiples of official retail, if such a thing as official retail even existed for that product. Military pay in Warsaw Pact countries during the late 1980s and early 1990s was poor by any standard. A Polish sergeant with 10 years of service earned approximately $30 per month at realistic exchange rates. A Czech corporal might earn $25, a Romanian lieutenant $40. These weren't poverty-level wages by Eastern European civilian standards. Military service provided stability that civilian employment often lacked, but the purchasing power was minimal. Monthly pay bought basic necessities with little left over for anything beyond survival. When Warsaw Pact soldiers were selected for exchange programs to visit American bases in the post-Cold War period, their expectations reflected this background. They assumed American military stores were propaganda displays, Potemkin villages stocked with the best available items to create false impressions while real stores remained hidden. They expected to see sparse selection, high prices, evidence of the capitalist exploitation their ideological training had described. They believed American soldiers were forced to purchase from overpriced shops that extracted profit from captive military customers. They anticipated finding conditions roughly comparable to what they knew from their own experience, possibly slightly better to maintain the propaganda fiction, but fundamentally similar. Soviet media had spent decades showing carefully selected images of American poverty, homeless people, unemployment lines, urban decay. These images were presented as typical of capitalism, rather than as social problems every system faced. The message was clear. Capitalism produced poverty for workers while enriching capitalists. Warsaw Pact soldiers arriving at American bases expected to see evidence supporting this narrative. What they found instead challenged every assumption they had been taught. The first impressions Warsaw Pact soldiers experienced entering American PX stores were consistently described in similar terms across hundreds of documented accounts from exchange programs. They expected sparse selection and found abundance. They anticipated poor quality and discovered brand-name products. They assumed high prices and calculated costs that, while expensive relative to their own wages, were affordable for American soldiers whose pay they would soon learn exceeded their own by factors of 20, 30, even 40. The electronic selection was overwhelming. 20 or more Sony models were typical for a medium-sized PX. Walkmans, portable CD players, boomboxes, shelf stereo systems, VCRs, cameras, calculators, electronic games. These products were simply unavailable in Eastern Europe through normal retail channels. When they appeared on black markets, they cost multiples of monthly wages. In the PX, they were displayed casually on shelves, priced in ways that suggested American soldiers purchased them routinely, rather than saving for months to afford a single item. A Czech soldier documented his PX visit by photographing every aisle, recognizing that his colleagues back home wouldn't believe his descriptions unless he provided photographic evidence. The images showed shelves fully stocked with consumer electronics, organized by brand and model, with price tags clearly visible. The abundance captured in those photographs contradicted decades of propaganda about capitalist scarcity and worker exploitation. The clothing section revealed similar disparities. Levi's 501 jeans, the quintessential American product that symbolized Western consumer culture throughout the Cold War, were stacked in multiple sizes with price tags showing $29.95. In Warsaw, those same jeans sold on the black market for $200 when available. The same product, affordable for an American private, represented nearly 7 months' wages for a Polish sergeant. Nike shoes, another Western brand with iconic status in Eastern Europe, were priced at $60 to $100, expensive for Americans, but within reach of soldiers' discretionary income. For Warsaw Pact soldiers, these prices represented months of saving, even if such products were available, which they typically weren't. A Hungarian officer spent more than an hour in the electronics section, examining stereo systems, reading specifications, calculating prices against his own monthly pay. The lowest price stereo in the PX cost approximately 6 months of his salary. An American specialist with 4 years of service could purchase the same stereo with less than 1 week's wages. The disparity was difficult to comprehend. How could economic systems produce such different outcomes for military personnel performing similar duties? Household goods offered quality, exceeding what civilian stores in Eastern Europe stocked, even when supplies were available. Small appliances were manufactured to standards that suggested durability rather than planned obsolescence. Tools were professional quality rather than the barely functional items typical of Eastern European production. Kitchen supplies included brands that Warsaw Pact soldiers recognized from advertisements in Western magazines they occasionally saw, but had never imagined they might actually purchase. The food section, while not the largest department in typical PX stores, still offered variety unimaginable to people accustomed to Eastern European shortages. Snacks, candy, soft drinks, convenience foods. These represented minor luxuries in Eastern Europe when available. In the PX, they filled shelves and were priced as casual purchases rather than treats requiring special occasions. A Romanian soldier purchased a single cassette tape, spending a significant portion of his exchange program allowance, explaining to his escort officer, "I want to own something from an American store, to remember this, to show my family that places like this exist." The prices, tagged in dollars, required calculation for Warsaw Pact soldiers to understand in terms of their own purchasing power. A single CD player cost $40, representing more than 2 months' pay for a Polish sergeant. An American private purchased the same item with approximately 1 day's wages after taxes. The ratio was staggering. Some items that Americans considered minor purchases represented weeks or months of Warsaw Pact military pay. The tax-free nature of PX pricing confused Warsaw Pact soldiers initially. They understood the prices were lower than American civilian stores, but didn't immediately grasp that this represented a military benefit, that American soldiers received purchasing advantages beyond their base pay. This created additional questions about the value American society placed on military service, compared to how Warsaw Pact countries treated their military personnel. The quantity of goods was perhaps most striking. Shelves were fully stocked. No empty spaces suggesting shortages. No lines of customers waiting for rationed items. No signs limiting purchases or announcing that products were unavailable. Everything visible on the shelves was apparently available for immediate purchase in whatever quantity customers wanted, subject only to their willingness to pay the marked prices. Personal accounts from Warsaw Pact soldiers documented reactions ranging from disbelief to anger to resignation. A Czech soldier photographed the entire store, explaining he needed proof because his colleagues wouldn't believe verbal descriptions. A Hungarian officer spent hours examining electronics, repeatedly calculating prices against his own pay to verify his initial assessments weren't errors. A Romanian soldier bought a single cassette tape, treasuring it as tangible evidence that the shopping experience was real. The cultural differences in how soldiers from different systems approached shopping were revealing. American soldiers shopped casually, making decisions quickly, treating the PX as a routine errand rather than a significant event. They didn't seem to appreciate the privilege of walking into a store where most products were available and affordable relative to their pay. Warsaw Pact soldiers were reverential, handling products carefully as if they were in a museum rather than a store. They spent extended time examining items, reading labels, comparing prices, trying to comprehend how such abundance could exist when they had been taught it was impossible under capitalism. The employee treatment Warsaw Pact soldiers observed differed dramatically from Eastern European retail experiences. PX staff were friendly, helpful, treated customers with courtesy, rather than the surly indifference typical of communist-era retail workers. This challenged another assumption Warsaw Pact soldiers had held, that capitalist retail exploited both workers and customers, creating hostile relationships. The reality appeared opposite. Employees seemed reasonably content. Customers were treated well. The transactions occurred smoothly without the antagonism that characterized shopping in Eastern Europe. Many Warsaw Pact soldiers returned to the PX multiple times during their exchange programs. One Polish officer described it as visiting the future, a glimpse of what life might be like if economic systems organized differently. Some spent their entire exchange program allowance on small items to bring home, not because the items themselves were particularly valuable, but because they wanted tangible proof of what they had seen, evidence they could show family and friends that American military stores actually existed as described. The purchasing power analysis that Warsaw Pact soldiers conducted, often informally, but sometimes with careful calculation, documented in journals or letters, revealed economic disparities that shocked even soldiers who had understood abstractly that Western countries were wealthier. An American E-4 specialist with 4 years of service earned approximately $1,200 per month in base pay, during 1990, before housing allowances, benefits, and other compensation. A Polish sergeant with 10 years of service, nominally a position of similar responsibility, earned approximately $30 per month at realistic exchange rates. The ratio was 40-1. The American soldier earned in a single day what the Polish sergeant earned in more than a month. But the disparity in purchasing power exceeded even these dramatic pay differences. Because consumer goods were subsidized, scarce, or unavailable in Eastern Europe, even the modest dollars Warsaw Pact soldiers earned couldn't purchase what American dollars bought. The effective purchasing power gap was larger than nominal wage comparisons suggested. Specific items illustrated the disparity concretely. A Sony Walkman priced at $40 in the PX represented approximately 33% of a single month as base pay for an American specialist. The same item represented 133% of a Polish sergeant's monthly pay, more than an entire month's wages. And that assumed the Polish sergeant could even find a Sony Walkman to purchase in Poland, which was unlikely without black market connections and prices multiples of the PX cost. Levi's jeans at $29.95 represented approximately 2.5% of an American specialist's monthly base pay. The same jeans represented 100% of a Polish sergeant's monthly pay. An American soldier could purchase jeans with a few hours' work. A Warsaw Pact soldier needed to save an entire month's wages for the same purchase, assuming the jeans were even available. The consumer goods access comparison extended beyond specific items to overall quality of life. The average American soldier owned a television, stereo system, likely a car if stationed in the United States, multiple changes of civilian clothing beyond the military-issue uniforms, and various consumer electronics that represented normal middle-class possessions. The average Warsaw Pact soldier owned a uniform, basic necessities, possibly a radio if fortunate, and little else beyond survival items. The lifestyle gap wasn't measured in degrees, it was measured in categories. Quality of life considerations that American soldiers complained about, low military pay compared to civilian equivalents, difficulty affording nice apartments or cars on military wages, were revealed to be complaints rooted in American standards rather than global comparisons. Warsaw Pact soldiers considered American privates wealthy beyond anything they had experienced. The American private who grumbled about living on base because he couldn't afford a nice apartment off base was living in conditions that exceeded what Warsaw Pact officers with decades of service enjoyed. The perspective shift was jarring. The reasons for these disparities were rooted in fundamental economic system differences. Western consumer economies produced goods at scale, creating efficiencies that reduced costs and made products affordable for ordinary workers. Competition among manufacturers drove innovation and price reduction. Market mechanisms allocated resources toward products consumers wanted rather than what central planners decided to produce. The result was abundance and affordability that centrally planned economies couldn't match. Eastern European centrally planned economies prioritized heavy industry and military production over consumer goods. Central planners allocated resources to what they determined were strategic priorities, which meant weapons, industrial equipment, and infrastructure rather than consumer electronics, quality clothing, or household goods that made daily life comfortable. Factories produced what plans specified rather than what consumers wanted. The result was shortages, poor quality, and prices that bore no relation to actual cost or value. Military production in Warsaw Pact countries focused on weapons systems and military equipment rather than soldier welfare. The assumption was that ideological motivation and patriotic duty would sustain military morale without requiring the material compensation Western militaries provided. This assumption proved increasingly incorrect as the Cold War progressed and information about Western living standards penetrated the Iron Curtain. Exchange rates compounded the distortions. Official exchange rates set by communist governments bore no relationship to purchasing power parity. The official rate might suggest that a Polish sergeant earned more dollars per month than the $30 realistic conversion indicated, but those official rates didn't reflect what money could actually purchase. When Warsaw Pact soldiers calculated PX prices using realistic assessments of purchasing power, the disparities were even more dramatic than nominal wage comparisons suggested. The aftermath of PX visits by Warsaw Pact soldiers rippled through Eastern European militaries, contributing to morale crises that accelerated the collapse of communist systems. Soldiers returning home from exchange programs spread stories throughout their units. "American privates live better than our colonels" became a common refrain in Polish, Czech, and Hungarian military barracks. The statement was literally true, based on purchasing power and consumer goods access. But it was psychologically devastating for Warsaw Pact military personnel who had devoted careers to service under systems that claimed to prioritize workers' welfare. Photographs from PX visits circulated among Warsaw Pact military units, passed from soldier to soldier, studied carefully by personnel trying to reconcile the images with what they had been taught about capitalism. The photos showed abundance, variety, reasonable prices, fully stocked shelves. Everything that communist propaganda had insisted was impossible under capitalist exploitation. The cognitive dissonance couldn't be resolved through ideological arguments when photographic evidence contradicted the propaganda directly. Military morale suffered as personnel realized Western soldiers lived far better despite performing similar duties. Recruitment became more difficult as young people learned about the disparities. Retention problems increased as career soldiers questioned why they should continue serving systems that compensated them so poorly compared to Western equivalents. The realization that ideological justifications were false, that the sacrifices they had made were based on lies, created bitterness that couldn't be remedied through propaganda. The economic reality revealed by PX visits couldn't be explained away through ideological frameworks. Communist theory predicted that capitalism would impoverish workers. The evidence demonstrated that capitalist systems provided living standards for ordinary soldiers that communist systems couldn't approach for senior officers. The theoretical framework was simply wrong, and no amount of argument could make the contradiction disappear. Personal decisions by Warsaw Pact soldiers reflected the impact of their PX experiences. Some emigrated west after their service obligations ended, with PX visits influencing their understanding of what life might be like outside communist systems. Others remained in their home countries, but became vocal critics of the old system, using their first-hand observations to challenge propaganda that continued even as communist governments weakened. The PX visit became a transformative experience for many, the moment when abstract understanding of economic disparities became concrete recognition that everything they had been taught was false. The legacy of Warsaw Pact soldiers' encounters with American PX stores extends decades beyond the immediate shock of the visits themselves. The modern impact is visible throughout former Warsaw Pact nations. Countries that joined NATO after the Cold War ended now send their soldiers to American bases where PX stores remain standard. The shock contemporary Eastern European soldiers experience is minimal. They arrive understanding that American military compensation exceeds their own, having grown up in market economies rather than communist systems. But veterans of the Cold War era remember when the visit to an American PX represented a revelation rather than routine. The Russian military attempted reforms after the Soviet collapse to improve soldier pay and conditions, recognizing that military morale had been damaged by revelations about living standards disparities. But Russian economic difficulties prevented closing the gap. Contemporary Russian soldiers still earn far less than American equivalents, and access to consumer goods, while vastly improved from Soviet times, remains limited compared to what American military personnel enjoy. The cultural memory of PX visits remains powerful for participants in 1990s exchange programs. Interviews with retired Polish, Czech, and Hungarian officers who visited American bases during that period consistently identify the PX visit as a turning point in their worldview. Not necessarily the moment they stopped believing in socialism. Many had already become skeptical. But the moment when abstract understanding of economic disparities became visceral recognition of the scale of difference between systems. Current military stores in Eastern European NATO countries have improved substantially from Soviet-era standards. They stock diverse goods, maintain adequate supply, offer reasonable quality, but they still lag Western standards in selection, pricing, and the overall shopping experience that American and Western European military stores provide. The gap has narrowed dramatically from 1991 levels, but it persists. The educational lesson from PX visits endures as a case study in how direct experience can contradict indoctrination. Warsaw Pact soldiers had received years of ideological training about capitalism's failures and socialism's superiority. A single shopping trip revealed more about actual economic system performance than decades of propaganda. The lesson suggests that exposure to reality is more powerful than any amount of theoretical argument, that people trust their own observations over official narratives when the two conflict, obviously. May 15, 1991. Sergeant Jan Kowalski stood in the Ramstein Air Base PX, calculating that his monthly pay as a 10-year veteran couldn't purchase a single Sony Walkman. He asked his American escort if this was a fake store created for visitors. He learned it was a normal PX, that every American base had one, that privates shopped there regularly. The revelation shattered his understanding of economic systems and the ideological framework that had structured his adult life. Warsaw Pact soldiers expected to see capitalist exploitation when they visited American military facilities. They anticipated finding evidence supporting the propaganda they had been taught, that capitalism exploited workers, that American soldiers lived poorly, that consumer abundance was a myth created to deceive observers. They expected sparse stores with poor selection and high prices, operated to extract maximum profit from captive military customers. What they discovered was abundance their own systems couldn't approach. Fully stocked shelves, brand-name products, prices that were expensive relative to their own wages, but affordable for American soldiers who earned 40 times more for performing similar duties. The selection exceeded the best civilian stores in Eastern Europe. The quality was superior to what their own military stores offered. The shopping experience revealed economic realities that contradicted everything they had been taught. The impact extended beyond individual soldiers to contribute to morale crises throughout Warsaw Pact militaries. Personnel who had devoted careers to service under communist systems learned that American privates lived better than Warsaw Pact colonels. The realization spread through units, contributing to recruitment difficulties and retention problems that accelerated as the Cold War ended. Young people asked why they should serve systems that compensated them so poorly compared to Western equivalents. Career soldiers questioned whether their sacrifices had been worthwhile when based on lies about economic systems. The photographs that circulated through Eastern European military units, showing American PX stores with their abundance and variety, provided evidence that no amount of propaganda could counter. The images were concrete proof that contradicted ideological arguments. Officials could claim the photos were fake, but soldiers who had visited the stores knew they were real. The contradiction between propaganda and reality became impossible to sustain. The lesson Warsaw Pact soldiers learned was simple but devastating. The exploitation wasn't in America. The exploitation was believing communist propaganda for 40 years. The exploitation was sacrificing for systems that claimed to prioritize workers while providing living standards far inferior to the capitalist exploitation they warned against. The exploitation was the lie itself, the decades of indoctrination that obscured reality until direct observation made the truth undeniable. 50 years of communist ideology insisted that capitalism exploited workers, that centrally planned economies served people better than market systems, that socialist organization provided superior outcomes even if consumer goods were less abundant. The theory sounded plausible in classrooms and propaganda lectures. But a single shopping trip revealed that the theory was false, that the practical results of economic systems contradicted Marxist predictions entirely, that American privates enjoyed living standards that communist systems couldn't provide for their senior officers. The PX visits represented microcosms of the broader revelation that ended the Cold War. When Eastern Europeans gained access to information about Western living standards, through visits, through television, through communications that penetrated the Iron Curtain, the comparison made continuing the old system untenable. People who had accepted hardship when told it was necessary for building socialism lost willingness to endure those hardships when they learned that Western workers lived far better under systems communism claimed to surpass. Warsaw Pact soldiers who visited American PX stores in the early 1990s experienced this revelation concentrated in shopping trips that lasted hours, but transformed understanding built over decades. They entered expecting propaganda displays and found reality that contradicted their expectations completely. They left with small purchases they treasured not for the item's value, but for what the items represented. Tangible proof that another world existed, that the economic systems they had served weren't providing what ideology promised, that the future might be very different from the past. The cassette tapes, the Walkmans, the t-shirts and small souvenirs that Warsaw Pact soldiers bought from American PX stores became artifacts of a historical moment when illusions shattered and reality became undeniable. Those modest purchases represented something more significant than their monetary value. They represented evidence that communist propaganda had been false, that Western living standards exceeded anything Eastern systems provided, and that the Cold War's outcome reflected not just military capability, but fundamental economic system performance that made Western victory inevitable once the comparison became clear.